I brought your book.
Oh, thank you.
Very comfortable, John. Are you comfortable?
Mm-hmm.
Também. Aqui. We're waiting for the president of the foundation. Vamos começar. O presidente da Fundação está a chegar neste instante para apresentar o professor Ikenberry.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to FLAD. Olá, boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos à FLAD. É para nós um grande prazer receber-vos aqui e ter tantas caras amigas e outras que nós esperamos que em breve se venham interessar pela FLAD aqui presente. Para aqueles em português que querem saber mais sobre a FLAD, que querem ter mais informação sobre a FLAD, eu aconselho ali uns cartõezinhos com QR Code que tem a forma mais fácil de pedir o acesso à informação da FLAD, porque por causa das regras da proteção de dados, nós precisamos ter o vosso consentimento para receberem informações nossas. So, welcome everyone, and thank you, Professor Ikenberry, for being here with us, and thank you, Carlos Gaspar, for being here with us also. This is the first session of a series of conferences that FLAD, sorry, I have been running, and I'm losing my breath, but no problem, is launching this year to discuss the state of our democracy and the way ahead. Throughout 2023, FLAD will bring to Portugal experts from the United States to discuss with us the challenges that our democracies are facing today, particularly in the transatlantic community. Over the next months, we will focus on the challenges, both internal, from threats at home, nationalism, populism, extremism, but external also. The situation, the war in Ukraine, Russia, China, great power competition, all of that. At FLAD, we want to promote an informed debate on these crucial issues because we believe that we all have a part in defending our democracies. And they are not threatened just by populist politicians or authoritarian states. All decision makers, researchers, media, as well as voters and society at large, have a responsibility and a role to play. This is why we are all here discussing together. And there is no better way to kick off this series than with John Ikenberry discussing the future of the liberal international order. John Ikenberry is Albert G. Miliband Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is one of the greatest scholars of international relations and especially of the liberal order. In his latest book, World Safe for Democracy, published in 2020, he discusses the past and future of liberal internationalism. His work and reflections help us safeguard the principles that are the bedrock of multilateralism and an open, rules-based international order. And now, I will pass to you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and thank you to the president, Rita Fadden, for introducing me, for that kind introduction, and for your staff here who have been fantastic. I just am so pleased to be here and to learn about your program and your series that you will be running this year. And I was honored to be the first speaker, the first victim, shall we say, for your series on democracy. And Carlos, an old friend, it's great to have you here and be on stage with you. So thank you so much for your hospitality and welcoming me here. Well, I think we're here at a moment where we're all worried about the international order. I think there's wide agreement that the post-World War II Western-led liberal order is in trouble. We're at a kind of world historical moment, a kind of crossroads moment, where the international order, its rules and institutions are up for grabs. We don't quite know where we're going. I've been thinking about this, that there is a kind of moment today that is unusual in my lifetime, a moment where you could really see very different pathways forward into the future with different combinations of order and disorder. People can be credible and make very pessimistic views about conflagration and existential environmental threats, and others, like myself tonight, who will try to argue that there is still a critical mass of enlightened self-interest around the world that can galvanize in a reform movement to bring us back into balance. But I do think that we are at a moment where the debate is truly widespread and important. Basic questions are being asked. What is the source of international order? What are the prospects for liberal democracy? Precisely this series conversation. Can liberal democracy make a comeback? Can democracy and capitalism be brought back into balance? The rising inequality, the disparity in wealth opportunities and life opportunities is extraordinary. And what is the future of liberal internationalism? That's my question. That is to say, the cooperative organization of international order led by the liberal democracies. And we might add to that something about Ukraine. Is the Ukraine war a sign of the unraveling of the liberal order or of its renewal? A surprising moment where an outside event has given us a new opportunity. I want to talk about those issues tonight. And I want to start as a scholar by taking the long view. That's sort of what I do for a living, to kind of put everything in world historical perspective. And democracy, taking the long view, is a story of ups and downs. It's more a story of struggle than it is of triumph. The liberal order did not begin in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down and Beethoven's Ode to Joy was played by the Grand Symphony led by Leonard Bernstein. Nor did it begin in 1945, when we do think there was a kind of opening to the liberal world at that moment after World War II. It's more of a 250-year tradition with the rise of liberal democracies in the age of democratic revolutions. And across those 250 years, it's been a story of golden eras and crises, of close-run things, deep struggles with alternative modernity projects. The 1930s and the 1940s, this was a moment when you could argue there was an existential moment or existential crisis for liberal democracy itself. 6 or 7 democracies were all that were left hanging in 1941, 42. I've been deeply influenced by a book by Ira Katznelson called Desolation and Enlightenment, where he talks about that 1930s, 1940s moment when you had all these troubles for liberal democracy. You had the Great Depression, you had the rise of fascism, you had the rise of totalitarianism, you had total war, you had the Holocaust, and then you had, not least, the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945. So one generation in 15 years saw it all. And the question I've been asking myself is, what did people like me who lived back then, liberals, who saw their world fall apart, how did they see what they were living through and what the prospects were? And Katznelson's book is a quite inspiring book, that they didn't give up. They rolled up their sleeves, they picked up the pieces, and they reimagined liberal society, liberal democracy for a new era. And in many ways, that is what I'm encouraging us to try to do again. But what is liberal internationalism? I've got a book here with the title, and what is the liberal international way of doing international relations? Well, it's a varied tradition. I said it dates back to the very rise of liberal democracy. There are laissez-faire and social democratic versions. Sometimes it's tied to empire in the 19th century and anti-empire in the 20th century. Sometimes it's seen as Western, sometimes it's seen as universal. Woodrow Wilson's phrase, to make a world safe for democracy, is in many ways the single best summation of the liberal international vision. What I've tried to argue in my new book is that it's been misunderstood, that phrase means to seek safety, not to spread democracy aggressively in other parts of the world, but to try to build, and this is my term, an ecosystem, a kind of environment in which liberal democracies and others can organize themselves. And you think about, why do liberal democracies need to work together? Well, multiple reasons. They have, interestingly, contradictory values that they have to manage. Think about liberal democracy. Liberty and equality. You can't have 100% of both. You have to balance and make trade-offs. Individualism and community. Sovereignty and interdependence. So there is an ongoing, never-ending struggle to figure out how all these values, each of which you prize, has to be put together with other values that are you equally prize, but that are not always consistent. Managing mutual vulnerabilities. The problem of modernity, of managing our growing interdependence. Liberal internationalism is fundamentally about that. And none of the other great traditions of ordering, such as realism or Marxism, put that at the center of their vision. And creating a kind of leverage of power to deal with those on the outside of liberal democracy that don't wish you well. So there is a basic set of ideas. There's a kind of gravitas intellectually and politically to the liberal international project across 200 years, I would argue. There are basic convictions that trade and openness properly managed is good. International institutions can facilitate cooperation. Liberal democracies have a special set of values, interests, and capacities to work together to generate cooperation more so than other kinds of countries. Liberal democracies have won the last 8 hegemonic wars. They've been on the side of all those great world historical moments. And finally, in a world of rising economic interdependence, the costs of lost autonomy associated with making binding agreements, multilateral cooperation, is less than the gains that you get from coordinating your policies. Those 4 convictions are at the heart of the liberal international project. And I would argue in the 21st century, those insights are as relevant today as they were before. Now, obviously, the liberal international order has taken it on the chin. It has met a moment of crisis and uncertainty. The kind of support for liberal internationalism is not what it might have been after the end of the Cold War. I think there are at least 3 proximate reasons for this over the last several decades. One is the Iraq War. In some sense, discredited a certain vein of American internationalism, conservative internationalism. The 2008 financial crisis had the effect of kind of neoliberalizing the world economy. And then thirdly, the liberal bet that China could join the WTO and join the liberal order and would eventually see it in its self-interest to make reforms and move in the direction of liberal democracy, which did not happen, quite the opposite. So there are questions about the credibility and viability of liberal internationalism. I would say that, on the other hand, we should not forget the achievements. And this is a moment when certain things that we care about have to be defended. We have to stand up and say, this is the narrative. This is how we got here. And this is what we've accomplished. And I do think that when you look at the post-World War II order, and I've written about this extensively in my book, there is a project here that can be built upon. Of creating not an empire, but creating a world system of rules and institutions anchored in security institutions like NATO, economic institutions like the Bretton Woods system, the WTO, global civil society institutions, creating frameworks for mutual gain and the protection of values. There's been a lot of work that we've done as liberal democracies. We've done things together more than any other kinds of countries and regimes in world history. We reopened the world economy after World War II, ushering in a golden age. We found a way for Germany and Japan, autocratic, authoritarian, fascist states, to redefine themselves and join this system as co-partners. And during this period, they were junior partners in a larger G7 world. France and Germany were able to bury their historic differences and launch the European project. That's number 3. The large stakeholders of the world economy, the so-called G7 countries, found a way to build permanent institutions to manage economic interdependence. And then, often forgotten, after World War II, every one of the European and North American governments redefined what it meant to be a democracy, from a kind of laissez-faire 19th century system to what we now call social democracy or the welfare state, creating new institutions to manage and trade off trade and openness with economic security at home. And then finally, a 6th accomplishment is creating a home for countries outside of the West that are making transitions towards liberal democracy. And I think of a great example, South Korea. I go to South Korea every year in the summer, and I've done this for 20 years. And it's an extraordinary country that went from a military dictatorship to a thriving democracy, from a developing country to a developed country. The first country that was a recipient of ODA to be a country that now gives ODA. So this is the kind of poster child of the liberal international order, creating a way station or a home, a welcome home for countries that are making these transitions. Let me just say, I've mentioned some of the failures and problems of liberal internationalism. A deeper failure, I think, is one that we often forget, which came at the end of the Cold War, when the Cold War era liberal order, remember that, most of you are too young to remember that, but that was the Cold War era up to 1989, when liberal democracy was inside of a larger global bipolar system. You had the communist system, you had the liberal democratic system, and inside of that bipolar system you had the democracies, the US, Europe, and others working together. It was called the free world. And they kind of built the system. And then when the Cold War ended, that inside order became the outside order. There was no other order-building project on offer in the global system. China was not yet on a 20, 30-year double-digit growth march. Russia was enfeebled. And so the liberal democratic world was kind of the only game in town, and countries like South Korea and others were joining in, not because they felt pressured, but because they were eager to be part of this growth and security coalition. But along the way, and this is why it's in some sense a failure of success, this order became global and it lost its coherence. And the order became less of a club that you join where you buy into a suite of rights and responsibilities and obligations. To be inside the liberal order is to not just get good things, but to uphold its values and to be part of a coalition to create security and growth. But in the post-Cold War period, it became more like a shopping center where you kind of walk in, like China walking into the WTO. They get trade credits and they are able to grow through trade, but they don't buy into the larger order. And so the club became a shopping mall, and it became less of a project that could organize itself to solve problems and move countries in the direction they all wanted to go. This brings me just to my final remarks, Carlos, if I can just have another 5 minutes or so. The Ukraine war, and I'll just make 3 points about this. Number one, the Ukraine war has had an interesting impact on that topic I've just been discussing, the liberal international order. And the first point I would make is that the war in Ukraine is about more than just the future of Ukraine. It really is what I would call a global order contest war. There is really now, it's possible to see several different types of order that are that are kind of struggling to dominate. And one is the one I've been describing, the Western model, with a track record that goes back to the 1945 period, that has a kind of game plan for generating security and wealth and glimmerings of social justice tied to these multilateral institutions. It's an open system. Geir Lundstad, the Norwegian political scientist, called it empire by invitation. If you're a liberal democracy or want to become one, you can join in. It's an order without geography. It's based on principles. And the other order is a more neo-imperial order that's based on geography and spheres of influence. And that's Russia, and in a more ambiguous, less clarified way, China as well. And so the contest between liberal order and illiberal order. And you see that in Ukraine and you see that in Taiwan. These are two democracies on the edge of very powerful illiberal states that want to rope them into their orbit. And those fragile democracies, Ukraine and Taiwan, don't want to be roped into that illiberal order. The Taiwanese are terrified of being integrated into a communist dictatorship. They've got a democracy, and they're proud of it. And Ukraine, in a different way, has a different legal status, indeed a stronger legal status than Taiwan does, feels the same way. So number one, the Ukraine war is a proxy war for what the international order will be going forward. Second point, things didn't turn out like Putin thought, and I would argue as Xi thought. Remember in February of 2022, the two leaders on the edge of the Olympics produced their manifesto for a post-American, post-Western, post-liberal, post-democratic world. And it was a very ambitious manifesto premised on the idea that the US was in decline, the West is in decline, it's fragmented, it's incapable of defending itself, it's on the decline, China's on the rise. My sense is that that was a miscalculation, that we've seen with the response to the Ukraine war that the West and the democratic world is more robust than we thought. It's kind of that order I've been describing, that system is kind of whirled back into action. It was kind of hibernating amidst all the crises for several years, indeed decades. Now it's kind of back in action. NATO has a role. The EU has charisma again. Only Putin could allow the EU to have charisma again. Germany has redefined its foreign policy identity. The US has a role. It realizes it can't walk away from this kind of linchpin role of security leadership and support for the system. It needs alliance partners and allies. It can't do it alone, but it sees that there's something that if it doesn't do it, it's not going to get done. And finally, I think the Iraq War has shown the precious, fragile spirit of liberty and freedom. Think about Zelensky. He didn't leave Kyiv when Putin invaded. He stayed there and said, "This is our country." And I think we've kind of forgotten that human emotion that was, in many ways, also hibernating as our liberal democracies were hibernating during the last couple of years. So it's kind of given us inspiration. It even gives me goosebumps to think about how people are willing to put their lives at risk for an ideal. And then finally, my last point is a lot of the world doesn't buy into this Western democratic support for Ukraine. And I think that we call them fence sitters. And I think that that group of countries, India, Brazil, others like them, are trying to figure out what to do. And they don't want to make decisions. They don't want to jump in one camp or the other. And I think, and this is my final point, one of the ways to build a better world and to make the world safe for democracy is to find a way to reach out to them and define the struggle in the 21st century as not a struggle to maintain Western hegemony, but to maintain the rule of law, a multilateral system organized around problem solving and pragmatic pursuit of the great problems of our age. And in doing that, I think we will see that more of the world than not will want to be on our side. And if they are, there's at least a glimmer of hope for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This was quite a tour de force. And I want to make two very brief comments. The first one, to say that it's very reassuring to find out that Professor Ikenberry is an optimist about the future of the international order, because he is usually right. Back in 1989, believe it or not, the discussion among scholars was about the decline of American hegemony. And the dominant position was that the decline of the United States, the decline of the Western order was inevitable. And John wrote a book with John Hall, The State, where he said no. No, both on a theoretical level, by criticizing what was called then the classic theory of hegemonic stability, and no, on a very pragmatic level, listing all the reasons why US hegemony was not about to end anytime soon. The most important topic he raised was the importance of norms, ideas, the ideas of enlightenment, the ideas which you referred to as the spirit of liberty. John was right in 1989. We hope that he will be right again in 2022. And certainly, there are good reasons to expect that. My second comment is trying to answer the question that you raised at the beginning about what the Ukraine war is showing us. Is it the unraveling of the liberal order or the renewal of the liberal order? And I would say both. Because never in the past, never since 1945, did a major power start a war, a shooting war, against another state in Europe, basically because the United States hegemony was able to stop first the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia and others to restart, to go back to interstate wars in Europe. And this was one of the great achievements. You mentioned that in 1989, that the greatest achievement of American order was to stop war between democracies, but also war between the two systems, the capitalist system, the socialist system. This is no longer the case.
Right.
So in a sense, even as we reconstruct the international liberal order, we are not going back to the same place we were before the Ukraine war. We are going into a post-hegemonic international order where things will be tougher. Certainly, it is. We should not repeat the mistake of Xi Jinping and Putin about and take for granted the decline of not only the United States but of the liberal order and of the liberal spirit. But still, we should not make the opposite error of thinking that nothing has changed. I think the thing that has changed the most is that the struggle between the great powers now, between US and China, has changed in nature. It is no longer the trivial, normal competition between great powers. It is a competition for order. What is at stake now is the shape of future international order. or if you will, the conflict has become a systemic conflict, not unlike the Cold War, where there were two systems, two orders struggling to, and this is what is, I think, new in the international system, is that we are going back to a period where we will have to fight for international liberal order against an alternative, and try to prevail. We did it once peacefully. We should remember the lessons, how we did it, and go back and try to do it again. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Carlos. That's wonderful. I'll just make one reflection on the last point, and I think we're going to open it up for questions in a second. So be prepared. But I do agree with your points, and particularly the last point is worth emphasizing, I think, that U.S.-China struggle, which we haven't really talked about. I didn't focus on it really directly in my remarks, but it is a different kind of struggle. It is a systemic competition increasingly. I don't think we would have said that 10 years ago. President Xi at that point may not have seen it in those terms, but with each passing year, the China dream, the view of the Chinese Communist Party in China is that its time has arrived and that it has a different model to give the world, maybe not as comprehensive as what the Western countries have offered. It's not necessarily a global vision, but it is a vision of building a world that's safe for autocracy, and it does involve a very different set of organizational arrangements and types of ways of doing business internationally. It shrinks or takes out of the system values that we associate with the Enlightenment and with liberal democracy, values of freedom of the press and of association, all these sort of values that, quite frankly, are enshrined in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which China has signed, and indeed in 2008, China did reaffirm on the anniversary of that great document that China adhered to it, but clearly in a different way, and not as the Western democracies do. So there is a kind of great contest. The German sociologist Jürgen Habermas has called these moments modernity projects, that if you look across the modern era, there have been places and states at different moments that have stepped forward and kind of offered a view of this is how we can move forward in the modern era under the deep revolutionary forces of science, technology, and modernity. And this has been the story really of the US and its allies in the last 100 years. And China is in some sense has a Jürgen Habermas type modernity project. So the stakes are high. It surprises me. I had thought that China was going to be a slightly different kind of state, so I do not get credit for predicting where we are today on that front. So I have a mixed record, but I do think there's a kind of hidden good news in that it forces us to say, what do we believe in? What do we want to defend? What kinds of institutions do we want to build and pass on to the next generation? Here's a question that I ask. I didn't ask this until I got old like I am now. And the question is, at the end of the 21st century, what kinds of institutions would we like to have in place so that our children and children's children will have political systems that can allow them to solve their era's problems? And I think it's clear, to me at least, that you would like to have institutions that are open, free, that have the capacity for scientists to tell us what they believe and not be disregarded, to have basic freedoms of speech and thriving debate about socioeconomic goals and problems. So that's kind of tells us what the agenda is for political thinking and action, and maybe China has helped us clarify and sharpen that perspective.
Exactly. Let us open the debate. I would, yes, one at a time. Please do, Cici, please do rise and state your name and institutional affiliation, if you will.
Good evening. Thank you both. It's been a luxury to be here listening to both of you. I had so many questions about the challenge that China poses, so I'm not going to go through that road. I was listening to, particularly to your comparison regarding the first half of the 20th century, and that is indeed an enormous lesson that we need to apprehend in order to get the big picture. But as I was listening to you, I was wondering about if there is something that this war in the Ukraine has shown, is that we indeed need leadership, and leadership from the United States. And in that sense, I haven't been so nervous about midterm elections as I was in the last ones. So my question to you would be, when we are looking, trying to analyze, in some cases, trying to understand the United States from a European perspective, what would you say are the main hurdles, the main obstacles for that leadership of the United States from a domestic point of view?
That's a great question, and I think the speaker series this spring will have some experts who will drill down on American domestic politics. It's not my specialty, but I have some views on it, particularly as it relates to what I think you said, and I agree with, which is, for better or worse, we still need the United States to be up there, offering to help build and support the security system, and to facilitate cooperation among allies and partners, and to champion the values that, if they aren't championed, will slowly kind of erode and wither away. I think the U.S., the midterm election was a kind of moment when we all kind of woke up and said, whoa, maybe there is enough sensibility, enough reasonableness in the American electorate to keep a steady ship, which looks like it's tilting, if not sinking. And but we aren't done yet. I do think that we have another cycle or two where we are going to work through what is a kind of failed party, a kind of hijacking of one of the two parties that has within it a faction that doesn't believe in democracy and playing by the rules. I don't think they are capable of hijacking the system fully and turning us into a kind of non-democracy. I think the guardrails, the deep institutions still have some capacity. I would like to see a few more younger American leaders with great charisma to stand up and take over, because Uncle Joe, I think, has done great work and will be long regarded as
Sam.
Sorry?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. Well, I was Uncle Joe Biden, not. It's true that Uncle Joe was Truman's term of endearment. Well, maybe not so much endearment for Joseph Stalin. So we do need to define our Joes. I think that the problems are deeper than Trump. That in the United States there is it's kind of the problem of liberal society that has as its enshrined values inclusion, equal opportunity, bringing into the mainstream women and people of color, and an immigrant society where we are lots of different things brought together, and we are stronger in being that kind of mixed, open, liberal society. And there is a faction in American liberal society, and it's there in every one of them, in Europe and elsewhere, that does not agree to that. They are alt-America. There's liberal America and there's alt-America, and they do not buy that premise. They want to live in a country that is dominated by, we'll just say, white Christian men. I think you could say that. And it is the demographic transformation of our society, the long-term shifts from a majority white to a minority and a more mixed society is deeply anxiety-producing for some factions in the United States. And so these are struggles to reconcile and to build new trust across these different social groups. And we need leadership, and we need the factions that want to see democracy work get business done. That's why I do think that we should congratulate Biden for the agenda that he's snuck through in the 2 years where he had a majority in the Congress, because it's not going to be there now. But infrastructure, lots of different things, showing us that we can do it. We're not that far away from what was done in the 1930s and 40s when that earlier moment came when we had to, in effect, kind of reinvent democracy. So it's a very profound challenge, and the U.S. could blow it. I wouldn't. I can tell a story of everything kind of falling apart, but I think, again, if there are enlightened interests that realize that you need to re-secure the framework, the institutions, and then we can struggle within it. But if you don't have that framework where we agree to win, but also we agree to lose, and to play by the rules even when we lose, and redouble our efforts and try to win the next time. And when you lose that is the most critical, for me, after all these years of thinking about this, that is the most critical component for what makes a democracy work. It's the ability to lose. Or to put it more abstractly, it's making sure in a political system that when you win, you don't win everything, and when you lose, you don't lose everything. You lose a little bit, but you don't lose everything, and so you can be in opposition and you can just work harder because you're going to win the next time. So the stakes are lowered, and so it's not a battle to the death. And unfortunately, in many of our democracies today, including the United States, there is a faction, I've just been trying to describe them, that sees the other side as not just an opposition, they see it as the enemy. And if that other side wins, our way of life is over with. That's existential. That's not consistent with low gains, low losses that are inherent in a democratic framework.
Thank you, Livia. Livia.
Do I need to have a microphone?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Mine is going to be, I think, a provocative question. I think it was Isaiah Berlin who said that history has no libretto, but to a certain extent, I believe that the liberal perspective of the world and of history believes that there is indeed a libretto. That's what explains liberal optimism. And my main worry is that sometimes that optimism generates complacency. Yesterday I went to a high school to talk with young people of 16 and 17 years old, and when I told them that the past 8 years in Europe were exceptional, they were baffled, because they thought, no, this is normal. Europe has always been like that. And I told them, no, absolutely not. So this is the provocative part. To a certain extent, the liberal perspective of history has in itself its own seeds of destruction, right? And what can we do to counter that? Thank you.
Isaiah Berlin did use that term. It was in a letter, one of his last letters before he died, to an old friend. He said, "History has no libretto." And I've always thought, that it's like history doesn't repeat itself, but as Mark Twain said, it does rhyme. So in some ways, there's not a kind of script, but there are themes and problems that reoccur. And I think Berlin would at least agree on that. I do think that Berlin offered a kind of liberalism for hard times. At the moment, in the age of liberal democratic disillusionment, Isaiah Berlin is an inspiration, because he was saying you can't necessarily get all the world to agree with you on all the substantive values, but you can try to protect the most basic values, which are more procedural and rights-based, the right to your own identity, your own freedom. Judith Sklar at Harvard had a similar kind of vision of the liberalism of fear, where you can't, writing in the age of totalitarianism, you have to allow for the variability of values across the system, and just try to agree on the most basic framework that acknowledges, despite your differences, that you need to coexist for any of those value bundles to survive. So you kind of go back to the basics, and I think that kind of liberalism probably is more useful now than certainly the grand end of history vision. Between Berlin and Sklar and Fukuyama, the very different liberal visions of modernity, there is a kind of middle vision that I think is a little stronger than Berlin, which is, I think of Obama as a kind of embodiment of this view that you can kind of bend the arc of history, using that phrase from Martin Luther King, that you can make some progress. And what I've tried to do in my book is precisely address the problem that your young people were mentioning, that liberalism, it thinks that everything is on a track towards greater everything that's good associated with liberal democracy, when in fact, look at our world, look at the problems, they seem to be getting greater. We don't seem to be able to agree on much. And I guess what I would say is that there is a little bit more that we can argue to our young people, that we have accomplished great things in the past. We should remember that, again, to use a term I've used several times, enlightened self-interest. We can work to build institutions that can solve problems. That liberalism is more about creating platforms for cooperation to solve problems than it is a celebration of the end of history. That it's about a kind of laboratory for figuring out what to do. It's a pragmatic, problem-oriented, reform-oriented tradition. That's the part that is kind of a little bit more optimistic than Berlin, but not necessarily buying into the view that there's a libretto. And that's where I think we can make the case. We have bent history. We live in a better world than earlier. We've built orders that have done more work than were done in the past. We do know that there is a way to thread the needle between anarchy, Hobbesian anarchy, and imperial systems where domination runs vertically down from a few to the many. So there's a third way where there's more consensual problem-solving, agreement to work at least minimalistically together. So I think there's a very, very powerful position there that gets you not necessarily to a libretto for Verdi, but a little bit of fun music from Puccini.
Why not? Or Mozart. Yes, please, Diana. Please state your name and, if possible, your affiliation. Thank you.
Hello, Diana Soler, Portuguese Institute of International Relations. I've been reading your books, so I went through your work over the years. And there's something that you said today that actually goes through several of the work I read and just popped a question on my mind. You said that when the United States won the Cold War, it stopped being an inside liberal hegemony where people were working to solve their problems and to defend something they considered dear. And suddenly it became global and it stopped working because everyone was shopping mall, was using democracy as a shopping mall and pick the parts that they wanted and leave behind those they did not want. So my question would be, and that goes with the Ukrainian war too, is it possible for the United States and liberal democracy to be hegemonic without some other outside that make us believe that our system is better and worth fighting for? Or when it goes global, we just lose sight of what we have? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a. I guess I'll make the short version first. I do think there in this what we were talking about earlier that having the other has been a convenient foil for rallying the coalition to work together in the name of liberal democracy. So I think that's true, and I think China may be doing that, and certainly Putin is doing that. So I think there's something about that. I do think there's been, over the last 100 years, different moments, and the liberal project has shifted from one to the other. So after the Cold War was a little bit like the moment after World War I in the eyes of Woodrow Wilson. Democracy was on the rise, or at least Wilson saw it. There were more democracies in 1920, 22. Things did not get bad economically and politically after World War I until somewhat later. There was a sense that history was on the side of liberal democracy, kind of like it was felt to be after 1989. And during those periods, the liberal project became more ambitious, more expansive. Wilson, the League of Nations, all countries can join. There was a sense that the liberal democratic world is so robust that the logic of socialization and integration will do a lot of work for you. Countries that aren't quite democratic will come into the League and then kind of sniff the vapors of the rule of law, international law, collective security, and so this will be the way that we can build international order almost by a decentralized system of inclusion. And so too after the end of the Cold War, in the Clinton era, in the 1990s, there was a real sense that the system will do a lot of the work. So it wasn't so much promoting democracy, it was kind of letting the machine run and letting inclusion and integration and accommodation and stakeholder development build out the system in a way that would make it a kind of one world order. The other kinds of moments are just the opposite. When you feel like liberal democracy is not the wave of the future, you're in a defensive position to try to save what you can. And I kind of think that's where we are now. And so you throw a lot overboard. You're not thinking about expanding. You're trying to keep something from entirely spinning out and unraveling. So I don't fault the 1990s for its kind of openness, when the inside system became the outside system. I think there's a new debate now among scholars about, could we have done the 1990s differently? And I think that's an important question. On the one side, there's John Mearsheimer, who's arguing we should have been containing China, because look what happened. We created a monster. I have written in response to that, I critique that, and I don't buy that argument. But and then there is the other side of the coin, that we should have been more inclusive, that the global South wasn't engaged as much, and we kind of sold the wrong kind of liberalism, a kind of neoliberalism. I'm a little bit more sympathetic to that the Washington consensus, that all you need to do is open up and privatize and integrate, and all things will work out. I think that was more of a regretful position. But I do think the larger point is that each era provides a different set of opportunities and constraints, and we're in a pretty constrained period now. So that's how I would respond.
Thank you. My name is Gonçalo. I'm a management student close by at ISEG. And in the last few years, I've been lucky enough to be the president of a youth association. Our main focus is politics and economics. And I feel that the major feeling nowadays, at least in youthful people, is that international organizations have been failing to deliver proper answers to some key questions. So we've been feeling kind of left out of some decisions taken by the EU, the WTO, and I was wondering, what can these institutions do to deliver to the middle classes, the lower classes, and the young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that goes to the heart of the earlier discussion about what the problems are, and that the problems are about democracy in some ways are problems of the internal renewal of the social contract that it's not so much international organizations aren't delivering, but that our democracies are not delivering. And the term many of you know, the term embedded liberalism, that the way in which our international institutions kind of came to life after World War II was in the context of a kind of bargain between openness, which ultimately led to the WTO, but before that GATT and the other Bretton Woods trade and monetary and financial regimes, and domestic social welfare, that workers would not simply be left to their own devices in an open world economy, but there would be social safety nets, and there would be a creative use of government to provide worker retraining and investments. And when push comes to shove, governments can protect sectors until those sectors find a way to become more competitive. So we call that embedded liberalism. And I think that was the secret to the long period of liberal international success, because it was a modified system. It was a system that did that balancing I was talking about earlier, that liberal societies have to balance competing values, openness and security, for example. So rebuilding the social contract, that brings us into these prosaic discussions of tax policy, of retirement protection, education funding. So the kind of just building back these opportunity systems and these protection systems inside of liberal democracies, and working through the EU, working through the international institutions, I think are part of that story. But each of our countries kind of has to work individually as well to identify a pathway where that these countries can make liberal democracy a system that delivers on what young people want, which as you know better than I do, is about life opportunities and security. So the easy part is what I've just done, which tell you what we need to do. The hard part is actually doing it. So I have to concede that.
Thank you. Patricia Deiner. Patricia.
Thank you very much. Patricia Dehnhardt, Portuguese Institute for International Relations. what I'm interested in your objective and claim of the renewal of international order is how we should envisage increased cooperation between Europe and Asia. So to say, how should we proceed with possibly institutionalizing a sort of transatlantic cooperation with the Trans-Pacific, with like-minded countries? And we're seeing this now. We're seeing the importance of Japan, of South Korea, even of India. And it seems to me that it's very important not only for the US to pivot or to redirect strategically to this area, which it already has been doing, but also for us as Europeans to ensure that we're not losing this train, and also at the same time to convince the US that while it is increasingly engaged in the systemic competition with China, it realizes that it's still important to uphold this transatlantic cooperation. So how could we ensure that there is increased cooperation between these two areas? Thank you.
That's a great question, and we haven't touched on that tonight yet, and I really wanted to coming into this meeting. I do think that there is a huge agenda for Europe and the United States, North America, to do together, not just Ukraine, but broader, and it includes East Asia as well. And increasingly you do see these Asia-Pacific, Atlantic-Pacific, I should say, connections. The major defense and foreign ministers from East Asia came to the NATO meeting. There's more NATO and East Asia. There's the Quad that brings India and Australia and India together with the United States. It's more not edgy military cooperation, but more human security, which is good, and that India wants to be on that level to be part of the system as well. And I think the United States is going to want to have a very strong working relationship with Europe on how to deal with China. And of course, that means that we're going to want to convince you that you're going to need to give up some economic engagement of China, but you're going to want to ask things of the United States as well, which is probably to say, let's don't have a Cold War. We do need to engage China on global warming, on lots of these global commons issues, pandemics. We need to encourage them to be inside the global system on WHO and all the different big issues that require all countries, not just democracies, to be working together, because they are problems that can only be solved when we're together. So I think more Atlantic-Pacific cooperation, more work together on China. Part of that, I think the United States does see China as a huge competitive challenge. It's a challenge, it's a competition about whether democracy, this is the American view as seen by the administration, it's a competition over can democracy perform as well or better than autocracy, so it's a competition of systems, but it's also a competition on who's going to command the scientific and technological heights for the rest of the century. Are we going to be working within Chinese platforms? Or are we going to have more open platforms that we have great sway over? And that's a different kind of competition. It's economic and technological, and that's where Biden is focusing the struggle. Not so much on military competition in the old system, but high-end technology, making sure that the commanding heights of this next generation artificial intelligence, circuits, quantum computing, all these different next generation science and technology vanguards are inside of and not outside of this liberal democratic world. And I think that's going to require all of us working together, because many of these technologies are tied to linkages, not just production, but technological production networks that link Holland and Germany and Taiwan in Japan and the United States. And so the kind of international relations in the 21st century is going to require us to learn a lot of new things about the nitty-gritty of technology, because that's where a lot of it's going to be. And there's going to be a lot of US-Europe engagement on that. So I'm hoping that we have an appetite for rolling up our sleeves and working at that level.
Thank you.
Your optimistic, Patrick Siegler-Lathrop, the American Club of Lisbon. Your optimistic vision is very tempting. I wish I could accept it. I guess I have a little bit more of European skepticism when I see, polarization, inequality growing so rapidly, the inadequate response to climate change. And I'm reminded of Friedman's book, The Storm Before the Calm, and his vision that America and the liberal West is going to go through a major crisis through the 30s, through the 2020s and into the 30s. And it is only later that the Western model will become supreme. And I'm wondering whether you could add to your comments the timing of when we can expect to accept more fully your optimism. I mean, are we talking short term? Are we talking only medium term? Or do we really have to look long term, given all the problems we have today?
Gosh, I'm tempted to say the calm will come many years from now, and none of us will be around to judge me right or wrong. But I am a little bit more sanguine than that. I guess I don't think, I start by, as I started my talk tonight, by saying that the post-1989 period, when everybody thought the world was moving in a direction that you could see it moving in a direction, and broadly speaking, there was a consensus on economic and political values that seemed to be gaining ground after 1989. I think what I tried to say tonight was that period, looking back, was an anomaly, that the longer period of 250 years is really a period of struggle. There's never a kind of utopia or a moment where you've arrived and everything's settled and everything's solved. It was John Dewey who said that democracy is like a laboratory. It's like an institution for solving problems. You don't know what the problem's going to be. Next year's problems are going to be different. 10 years from now, when we come back, it may not be pandemics. It may be something entirely different that we don't know about, associated with bioengineering, biomedical engineering, or artificial intelligence that we just can't. It's a threat that is almost existential that we can't even envisage now. We have to assume that those sorts of things are going to happen. So what do we do now is not so much solve those problems directly, but create institutions for problem solving. And the only game in town for that comes out of this liberal tradition. I don't see it coming out of China. I don't see it coming out of the great intellectual traditions of Marxism or realism. It's this more kind of ultimately unsatisfactory or unsatisfying approach to messy problem solving under conditions of uncertainty, where we do the best we can and then we pass it on to the next generation. So I think that's sort of the way it is. And again, it's not entirely a utopian vision. We have moved the world in a positive direction. I'm not defending the United States so much as the modern liberal project more generally has taken us from an era where we had slavery and we had oppression and we had one half of the gender population unable to vote. We had child labor. We've moved the bar up for what we expect in our societies. We want better societies. We expect better societies than generations earlier did. And so in that sense, we've created expectations that are going to be difficult to fulfill. But partly the struggle, the work in progress is the ideology that I'm trying to present tonight as the most practical and functional ideology, that a work in progress in two senses. It's a work in progress, making progress, but it's also a work in progress. It's still ongoing. It's not yet there, and it always will be kind of ongoing. And that's very much the heart of the liberal democratic tradition that goes all the way back to the 18th century of setting out really high principles and then trying to do a little bit better to get closer to it. Hypocrisy, that is to say the failure to live up to your principles, is not a bug, it's a characteristic of liberal order. You want to put yourself in a position where you're embarrassed that you aren't doing as well as you said you want to do. That's the gap between what you want and what you are doing is a creative gap for putting pressure on you to rethink, reform, build, rebuild. So that's in this kind of liberal democratic world, and I think in the face of these problems that you think are going to be there for decades, the storm before the calm, I don't disagree with that, but I do, and it may be, I can't give you a decade count on that, but I do think that it's going to make us want more rather than less open, rule-based societies that can work under the shadow of enlightened self-interest and scientific knowledge to find out what the hell are we going to do? What the hell are we going to do? What are we going to do when we don't make the 2 centigrade? We aren't going to make it, I don't think. So we've got a lot of work to do. So what kind of world is best organized to deal with these awful problems? And I can't think of any other than some kind of reorganized, revitalized order such as we've been discussing tonight.
Thank you very much. My name is Monica Diaz from the Institute for Political Studies. Thank you for bringing us such an insight and so much hope. You sounded very Kantian, and this idea of if, so that we have to launch, and I thank you very much for bringing him back. I have a question on technology that you mentioned before, and this has to do with the presumption you had that we are still thinking about a modernist project. And I think that technology had a lot to do with a democratic explosion. Walter Benjamin explains this very well, but also Woodrow Wilson. So, aren't we today maybe already in a post-modern? Isn't the challenge one of a post-modern and not a modern? Because the challenges of technology, not only in warfare, but especially on a civil level, on control of people, of civil society, are so strong, and even our behavior are changing so much that maybe this threat to this threat of new technologies on liberalism, on liberal internationalism is maybe much stronger. I would very much to hear a little bit more on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, and every question gets harder and harder. So, thankfully the clock will save me eventually here. But I share your anxiety about technology. Again, my first point would be take the long view. It's been like that. We've had technologies that have emerged, not least with the nuclear revolution, the smashing of the atom, and many others along the way that have had implications for humanity that are existential, and they haven't gone away. We're still working with those. Modernity has always been a kind of, as I like to say, and I said it, I think, in the book somewhere, a kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of phenomenon. Technology and the scientific revolutions, wave after wave, have brought greatness to and greater capacity for humans to do things, to achieve things, to go to the moon, to discover things, to understand better about who we are and where we're living and what our environment is. It's not as dark and shadowy. We know cause and effect in the natural world in a better way. All of that's good. And then, of course, the medical revolutions have been extraordinary. Many of us are alive today because we've got vaccines out in a year rather than 10 years. So the upside is clearly there, the downside as well. And I think it's kind of, the way I've put it, that global governance is what states invent to harvest the upside of modernity and guard against the downside. So we can't, we don't really have any escape from this, because we can't simply call a halt to modernity and interdependence and each go into our little cells or into our dugouts, but we have to work together to try to survive and find the upside. I do think that, and this will be the occasion, it's much more complicated than we can handle tonight, but I think the technologies of artificial intelligence are extraordinary, and everything I've said tonight is premised on a kind of enlightenment assumption. I've used the term enlightened self-interest, that there is a kind of baseline knowledge that is out there, a kind of reality that we can all understand. This is kind of David Hume 101. And it's that it's not made up, it's not postmodern, and you kick a rock, your toe will hurt. The sense that there is a common baseline of knowledge that we can have, and on that base we can disagree, but we won't disagree on the facts. We'll disagree on the values and the opinions. That baseline is in trouble, potentially, because of these technologies that can allow us to imbibe new realities that are not based on the physical world. And that's dangerous. And I don't know how we manage that, but it's going to take the kind of problem-solving cooperation that we've been talking about today. It will probably take enlightened, self-interest-driven countries like that exist in the European Union to put restraints on the import of technologies that might be insidiously destructive of that kind of information. And if Europe does it, then I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to produce that technology because that market is closed to me. That kind of, you've got to hit hard. You've got to play hardball with the bad guys, and you need to have islands of enlightened thinking to create an alternative and make that alternative remunerative to people of business around the world and technology producers. So that's just a hint at what it's going to take.
It's a tall order. One last question.
Sure.
Anna?
My name is Ana Gomes. I'm a former member of the European Parliament. Don't you think that equality should be a crucial objective for democracies to indeed save the liberal international order? Because if we continue to neglect equality, if we have, guys like Elon Musk paying less taxes than a peasant in Uganda, of course, our states won't be able to deliver the opportunities that the young people naturally claim for. But they won't be able as well to defend themselves. The Karl Popper's democracy paradox is there. I agree with you that we can't have a winner-takes-it-all approach in democracy, but we should have red lines. We should know who are our enemies, because there are enemies of democracy. And in order not to play into their hands and to give them ammunition, isn't the question of fighting for equality absolutely central, and it has been dramatically neglected by our democracies?
Yes. I agree totally. And I don't mean that flippant. I think I agree with you totally. And I hope a little bit of what I said tonight fits into that view. Certainly, I mentioned neoliberalism, and the 2008 financial crisis, which really accelerated inequality. It's been driven by lots of forces: technology and trade and investment. The gains from trade increasingly give way to the losses in the next increment of trade. After a certain level, doesn't generate prosperity that can be distributed more equally. It creates new inequalities within societies across the trading countries. So there are limits to that open system that I've been describing and its values. You've got to balance it. You've got to have what I would have called embedded liberalism. And you're absolutely right, and philosophers have noted this from the beginning of the democratic era, that democracy without some measure of widely distributed of assets and opportunities is not going to be democracy at all. And so the inequality level is just unbelievably frightening. Since COVID, since 2019, the Oxfam organization has put out this very striking information that the top 1% of the earners in the world have received as much wealth gain since 2019 as the other 99% combined. That's not sustainable. And it's not just that we have more poor people relative to a smaller number of very rich people. It's that we also have money that is distributed unequally and then used in politics in all sorts of ways. In the United States, there's all this unregulated money into campaigns. So you can have dark money, not just money in America used without reference to campaigns in the United States, but foreign money. And there are all sorts of tawdry cases that the press are bringing up day in, day out about how money finds itself, ill-gotten money often, into American political campaigns, and that distorts democracy as well. So there's multiple levels to this problem. Equality, I don't think we'll ever. I think full equality of income is probably outside the liberal democratic model, because the liberal democratic model also has this thing called liberty. So it's a balance. But again, what we do know, and what I agree with you about, is that we are out of balance now.
Thank you. Mrs. President, I think that your conference series on democracy are off to a very good start. Thanks to Professor John Ikenberry. I thank you all for coming. Thank you, John. It was fantastic. Hope you come back soon.
Thank you. Thank you.